Just a friendly reminder, again, Grid Shell prototype version 1.0 is due as soon as possible. Ideally by later this week when we meet again on Wednesday, but if it has to wait until next week, then get it done, bring it in next week, we'll take a look, and you'll get credit. The key thing is that you got to do it once, and then a second time. Iterating this is really important. It'd be like a complete fluke, and it's actually quite rare for you to just get everything right the first time. So anyway, working out the bugs is part of the message here. Today we're going to talk about measuring performance, and I'm going to do some demonstrations in front of you. But I assume that everybody's busy trying to get laser cutter time, cutting the components out. If you haven't prepped your files already, which some of you are probably still doing, and then you have a bunch of assembly to do as well, right? So, you'll see that there's just a reminder here for 300 points. That first prototype, getting it done. Although you don't really submit it to the canvas, it's a physical thing, so you bring it to class with you when you have it done, or have it, or have when you're ready to show me how well it did or didn't work. Okay. All right. So again, just a reminder. That's due on the 9th at the drop dead latest, just because the following week the final prototype is due. So I want you to have some time to sort of turn these things around and take what you've learned from the first time. Right, we're here today, right? We'll talk about performance. Ideally, you can get your final prototype, bring it in by next time we meet on Wednesday. You get extra credit. But if not, just bring it in sometime Monday or Wednesday next week. Like I said, we're getting close to the end. I'd like to wrap up Project 2 by mid-November. And then that gives you a little bit of breathing room as far as this class is concerned for any outside work after that. So I find that's really important as we get closer to Thanksgiving and holidays, and when we get back, you have a week and a half or so, when you present your final projects in studio. So just getting sort of out of your way is part of the gesture to you guys with the trying to sort of schedule things out in advance. All right, so here's where we are today. I'll upload the video that I'm recording at the moment at the end of class. But if you want to download the file that I'm showing today, there it is in my Google Drive. So that's the link. You probably want to download that and take a look. What I would recommend is that you pay attention up here. It's Monday, no pressure, right? I assume that you're not going to have anything between, when it comes to this new material, anything between now and Wednesday to do. Because I assume that you guys are working like mad hell trying to get these laser cuts, right? All right, so, but nevertheless, in parallel with that, we do want to introduce this stuff and get it up on your radar so that when you can start to begin to close this sort of feedback loop, right? So prototyping this once, forcing you to laser cut it sooner rather than later. The next time around, you will be taking into account production constraints and sort of completing that feedback loop. Design to production, materials, assembly, CNC technologies, and feeding that back into the beginning, retweaking your design, and completing that feedback loop. The other feedback loop that we're going to deal with is performance. So we're going to look at these shaping components and also talk about not only do they need to look cool, but they also need to perform in a particular way. And so go ahead and take a look at that file if you'd want, but feel free for today just to keep your eyes up here and watch what I'm doing and try to conceptually understand what's going on, right? Don't get lost in the weeds trying to figure out which widget I'm on back at your screen if you don't, if you think that might be an issue, okay? All right, so, right. It says the due date's November 1st, which is the next time we meet for prototype number 1. But again, I'm giving you guys till the 9th. So if you get it in, if you bring it in, next time we meet on Wednesday, you get some extra credit, of course, like I promised. But next week, make sure you bring it in either Monday or Wednesday. So I can give you credit, we can take a look at it, we can talk about the what happened and how to do it even better the next time around. All right, so, ta-da, here we go. I'm going to start very simply with one of our shell geometries, right? The sort of sine You see sort of sine wave scape that we made. You pick either this one or the saddle-shaped one, which I have also in here, and we can do that one as well, right? This one. Okay. But today I want to talk more about how we can begin to inform the geometry of your components directly from solar radiation values, right? So we can use Grasshopper to simulate and then measure solar radiation in this case, and then use those values, plug them back into the recipe to inform the parameters. So that the red areas that get a lot of solar radiation, we know we need a lot of shade, suddenly we can begin to take those numbers and plug them in to inform how open or closed your components are. And each cell, then, as it begins to sort of understand how much solar radiation it's at, can then close or open accordingly. So you can make a sort of more informed, optimized set of differentiated components across this grid shell. All right, so here we go. You'll see it's nicely wrapped in a bow in this file, and I'm just going to go through it with you step by step. But in short, just turn these off, right? I'm giving you a set of 6 light ray directions, and we feed those into Grasshopper. We take this surface, we break it up into quads just like you have been. We take each quad, we begin to measure the average solar radiation based off of each of these solar rays to begin to understand where we have more and less solar radiation according to our performance criteria and the sun rays I gave you to measure. Then what we do is we rebuild the mesh, repainting it. So you can see that it goes from a spectrum from red to blue, right? Red meaning lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of direct solar radiation. Then orange and yellow all the way to blue, meaning less and less and less. Okay. I think when you look at the direction these rays are going, and when you start to see how these things work out, when I bake this back into lighting, I think you won't be too surprised to see where there's shade and where there's not. Then we take those values and we plug them in to inform the geometry of, in this case, a very simple component, just basically half a pyramid, something that we said you couldn't do because it's just too simple. So that's why I'm using this as the example today. You can see where the red areas are. These things are mostly closed off. Can you see the component sort of really closes things off quite a bit? And as it gets into the oranges and yellows, it's about halfway. And when it gets into the light blue, it's about 3/4 of the way open. And when it gets to the dark blue, it's almost the whole way open, right? So this is the making a gradient effect where we begin to measure, in this case, solar geometry, measure it up against our real geometry. We get those values and we can actually design them. So instead of just testing stuff and then trying to tweak things, we can use the actual energy values in our recipe itself, okay? Just really kind of handy. It sort of closes that performance feedback loop. All right, so that's kind of what it is in a nutshell. You can see that for this example file I gave you, I grouped things and notated each group. So we can sort of break this up into a large sort of full spaghetti into this clump, and this clump, and this clump, and this clump, and this clump. You can zoom in on each clump, step by step, so you can see what's going on. And it's sort of a reminder to you as you go through this, what's actually happening. Some of this looks very familiar. Dividing the shell surface into smaller quads. We've been here how many times now, right? For instance. So let's do that, right? All right. You might recognize this from the last 4 weeks that we've been working on grid shell. We take a surface and then we break it up into a set of quads, right? In this case, this might look a little different than yours just because I'm not plugging in my surface here. I'm actually using this widget. It goes from 0 to 1, 0 to 1, and then I recharacterize the surface. That's the same thing. Break it up into 10 by 10 grid. In other words, there's more than one way to peel the banana. And so, we're doing basically the same thing here. Now you notice that it has this box around it. That's because I grouped things together. So I can just click on that selection box and move things together in that one group. Right? All right. Then over here, completely different sort of part of the Grasshopper recipe, right? Just in parallel with the other thing. It doesn't really connect up with it yet at all. Here's where I'm generating some light rays. So I give it the XY000 origin point. I give it some XY sort of azimuth values. I give it altitude values. And then basically I use those as sort of rays to simulate, let's say, like 6 different conditions I want you to average out over the year. And that's really quite fictional. You can tell it's not really like, the sun doesn't really move like that on a daily basis, right? It moves, of course, on an arc, but the arc is sort of tilted. So we can always measure from an azimuth and an altitude. Sort of geometry. You guys had that yet? ECS in spring, probably. Talk about that a lot. Maybe you guys talked about that in the studio. Yeah, like how the sun works? A little bit? What's that?
I took astrology.
Astronomy, not astrology. Just figure out where Taurus is in the sky. All right. Right. I mean, I could actually show you guys that there is a plugin that I have called Honeybee and Ladybug where you can actually simply give it your location. It has weather files you upload from, let's say, just like Terry Reid now, International Airport. You can get the airports from around, you get the weather data, and you can actually bring stuff in. And you can get like a bunch of this stuff sort of visualized for you. But this is like the tip of the iceberg. Right? So this is just me giving you a very small sample, right, to deal with when it comes to, let's say, a sun, like 6 different directions to the sun. This isn't an annual average, this isn't a monthly average, this isn't a weekly average or daily average, right? It's just me picking 6 random angles and saying, if you can do it with this, you can do it with me. All right, so. But the way this works is this is called point polar. So what you do is you give it a point in space, you give it an azimuth, which means I start at 0 and I can go all the way around 90, 180, 270, 360 again, right? And then also an altitude from 0 to 90, right? And then whatever that trajectory is, I can also give it a distance. Then I get a point in space, right? So point polar, I give it polar coordinates, an azimuth, an altitude, and a distance. And what that does is that generates points out here in space. Then I can basically create lines that go from each of these as their start point back to this original point that I have here and create sun rays. And then I actually just put a sphere at the end of these things just to sort of, again, to show you where that sun would be positioned. Now we use these rays basically as sort of parallel directions. Where if the sun is in that position, we can assume that everything hitting a patch for all practical purposes that we'd be measuring in a site, all parallel to that ray, right? Okay. So this would be 6 times out of the year. That I've given you. All right, and that's just a given. That's just something I give you. All right. Now we get all the way over to here, right? So we have our quads, we have our light rays, and here's where we take our quads and we apply those light rays to each of the quads, and we measure the solar radiation values of the rays that actually make it to quads, right? Now it's also, not only is it measuring how many of those rays actually hit the quads, but it's also using all those quads and sort of seeing what is occluded, what's shaded, right? And it's also measuring the angle of incidence, right? So in other words, have you guys ever noticed this? Like sometimes, like in the summertime when the sun is still low in the sky, and it's hitting you like horizontally, it's hotter than hell when it's hitting your face. And that's because it's hitting your forehead, like your cheeks, like the angle of incidence is like perpendicular to your face surface, right? And it's hotter than it's not, right? In other words, if anything, a little bit bounces off here, but most of it's converted heat, right? When that angle of incidence gets less and less steep, right? Then more of it can bounce off in the angle of incidence, right? So in other words, you have this, you have the opposite angle, right? Some of it gets converted to heat, but oftentimes a lot more of it can bounce off. All right, so anyway, it also measures that angle of incidence in sort of the normal direction of the surface and starts to understand it. So one of the things that we're doing here that we haven't really talked about is we're converting our quads to meshes. What that does is a mesh is a different way of storing the sort of complex geometry of the surface. Surface and a mesh are completely different. So remember, in Rhino, surfaces are stored as complex polynomials. They're basically equations underneath the hood. You're just solving for x, y, and z coordinates as you start to plug things in. In meshes, right, we have very specific locations for triangles or quads. Each of those has a set number of vertices, either 3 or 4. And each of those points or vertices or points have an x, y, and z location. Right? Each of those faces, right, in the mesh, they're either a triangle or a quad, and they also have a top face and a bottom face, or a front and a back, right? Also, depending on, you have like closed edges or coincident edges. You also have naked edges. In other words, an edge and an edge that doesn't actually meet up with another edge, i.e. a hole or an edge. And so it gets really kind of complex really quick if you're 3D printed, and you sort of get you sort of know about meshes. Even if it's not explicit, you start to understand there's things like surface normal, mesh normals, mesh faces, making sure that things line up, trying to figure out where there are holes, healing the holes, trying to make sure that things are actually watertight, etc. When things are manifold, then there's suddenly an inside and an outside, or a top and a bottom. And Rhino loves it, and your slicer program in 3D printing loves it. When it's ambiguous, then suddenly the 3D printer doesn't know which parts to print in or which parts to print out, right? So what's inside and out, if it's not, when it slices it up in sections, if that's not very clear, then suddenly you start to get errors. All right, so don't ask me what the bunnies are doing. They're multiplying, I guess. That's kind of a crude widget. It's not even springtime yet, so happy Halloween, everyone. Maybe I should convert the gradient over here, the color gradient, to like Halloween colors or something. But all right, but basically what this does is you'll see an input, convert to meshes. I'm feeding the quads in, list of surfaces, little list of quads. They're each can convert to meshes. They get fed into here, along with our light rays, they get fed into here. So I'm giving it some energy values, and the reason I think I have 6 different rays, right? So I think I'm just saying, like, take one value of 10,000 for energy, and then make 6 of them, and then plug them in, so each ray gets a 10,000 value, energy value, right? Yeah. Anyway, then what it does is it spits out and says, okay, if each intermediate ray hitting spot on in the normal of these surfaces 10,000. Is a value of 10,000. Start to measure in each ray as it hits each of these mesh values, right? So what it does is it sort of interpolates from 0 to 10,000. Something that's not hitting at all will be 0. Something that only hits half the time on the average would be 5,000. Something that hits the whole time on average would be 10,000. Right? And so interpolating back and forth between them. Right? That's what these energy values are coming out. And you'll see that there's a lot, and that they're dashed, meaning that we get a big complex data tree coming out. What's interesting about this, and what some of you have started to figure out, some over the weekend, some before the weekend, is that oftentimes when I have these rubber bands and they're solid, and I have solid plugged in, I get good results out. And oftentimes when I have a dash and a dash and a dash plugged in, I get good results out. But sometimes when I get solid and dashed results plugged into different things in the same widget, things start to act really weird, right? They're not doing what you want them to do. Sometimes it generates so much data, like it sort of exponentially grows the data, which then again makes your computer really laggy and slow. You wait 5 minutes for it just to come out of its sort of processing coma, so to say, right? So anyway, keep that in mind, right? That's what these dashed versus a solid mean. These are lists, one single data point or a list of data points. These are data trees, meaning that they're actually a list of lists of each of these. All right. Now, up here you'll see that we bring these energy values and we plug them into this color gradient. All this does is this takes our mesh and it breaks it up into its vertices and faces. And then we plug those vertices and faces into a new mesh widget And this time, the only ingredient that we add in this new mesh, we rebuild the mesh, are all these color values, right? So each of these vertices and faces now have color values attached to them because they have energy values attached to them. We plug in the energy values and tell what the minimum and maximum energy value is. The maximum over here, the minimum over here, and then plug these in and sort of maps them across basically between the minimum and maximum along this continuum, assigns an RGB value which gets plugged in here. So we get a data tree of RGB values that coincide with the vertices and faces. So when we bring this in, we basically take our mesh apart, rebuild it, and then assign coloration to each vertex as well. Okay? And that's how we get something that's colored this way. All right, so I'm just going to bake this in really quickly on this layer. Close this out, and you can see what we have here, right? Right, and so when you look at where the sun rays were coming from over here, you can see that there's a lot of red, and then gradually some orange, some yellow, some blue, right? Not a huge surprise there. Let's see here. All right, now, we went up to this branch. This is where we started generating these energy values and measuring them, right? We started plugged them in and said, okay, here's our 6 directions, 10,000 gigawatts of stuff, from each of these bolts. Now figure out, how much of that's actually hitting each of these spots on our quads. Speeds out the energy values. We use them up here to recolor the mesh, just so visually we can sort of see the data, right? And that's really important. I mean, if we can't figure out how to visualize the data, then scientists certainly won't, right? They're kind of screwed. So that sort of spirit of information is beautiful. We need to sort of like make this really digestible and easy to sort of understand. What's also nice about that is that we can then compare and double check our results and sort of see if everything seems to be working correctly. That's one of the sort of spot checks we can do for quality insurance, quality control. But we also bring these energy values down here, and we do just a little bit of math to them. Now, this isn't very complex math, I will say. So if you think about this, you take a quad and you break it up into a mesh, which basically turns it into a set of quads. And there might be 16 4x4 quads inside of each of these, 4x4 sort of faces of a mesh inside each of these quads. So now we have 16 values. And what I'm doing is I'm just measuring or adding up all the values for each of these quads, right? So I can begin to understand which quads have the most energy hitting them, which quads have the least amount of energy. And I do that with a mass addition tool. So what this does, I'm plugging in something that has, all right, so let's take a look at this data tree for a moment, right? You guys ready for this? All right. So here's how you read a data tree, right? We have brackets on the left-hand side, and we have in parentheses n equals some number on the right-hand side, right? So think about this just for a moment, right? We have 10 by 10 matrix of quads, right? 100 quads. We broke our surface up into these little quads, right? 100 of them, right? We start at 0, we end at 99. Each of these tree branches corresponds to one of those quads, right? There's 100 of them. Not a big surprise. Now, inside each of these, this is a list, but inside each of these branches, we have a list of 25 items, right? So it's a list nested within inside another list. So what it did is when it broke up each of these quads into a mesh with faces and vertices, 25 of them, in fact, right? You remember that, well, these are the 25 for this quad, and these were the 25 vertices for this quad, and these were the 25 vertices for this quad. So that's why it does that. It's really just a handy way to sort of keep all the data separated and organized for you so you can use it again later, okay? If we just got a big dumb list of whatever 25 times 100 is, it should be 2,500, 2,500 things, and it's all just randomly organized, right? That would not be very useful. But in this case, it is, right? So in other words, the first quad, here's the 25 things, 25 values for that, right? So these are 25 energy values because we had 25 vertices, and each of those vertices gets populated with each of those rays. Right? So we get 25 values out. And so what this mass addition does when I plug this in is it takes the first 25 values and adds them together. Then it takes these 25 values and adds those together. And these 25 values and adds those together. And these 25 values and adds these together. That number, anywhere from 0 to 10,000, then added to another 0 to 10,000, then another 0 to 10,000, right? Starts to then give an indication of how much solar radiation is in each of these, right? So if I take the 25 values here and add them together, 25 values from here and add them together, I can start comparing these things. We get apples to apples. And if you look at this, once I do that, I look at the results, right? I've actually flattened the results, but I get 100 results out, right? So I've taken 25 values, added them together. These 25 values, added them together. I get 100 values out of it, right? Now, if I just made a quick copy of this without the flattening, let's see what that looks like, right? So again, just not to confuse you here, right? We went from a data tree with 100 branches, 25 items in each branch, right? And now we have 100 branches, but in each of those branches, we added those 25 values together just to create one value, just one big sum, right? So now we have 100 branches with one value inside each one. In this case, because I'm working with lists all the way through, I flatten it back onto the list right here. That's again where I look up what's being plugged in later on. And if I say, well, I'm plugging in a list here, but I'm plugging in a data tree here, that can get really, things don't align, right? It's all about the data matching. How you input for A and you input for B and how they sort of match things up, right? Okay. So, what I want later on is just a done list, so that's what I do. I flatten it out here into a list. I can plug it in here, I can plug it in here, I can plug that in there, blah, 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 blah. All right, so let's talk about what happens after that. So what's interesting about this is you can see that I start to get just sort of total sums of how much solar radiation is in each watt. 100 of them, 66,000, 74,000, right? Now, there's a big long list of stuff, 100 of them. If I want to sort of normalize it between 0 and 1, sort of understand what the minimum value is, what the maximum value is, there's a way to do that, right? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to plug this in as a big list. I'm asking Grasshopper to give me the bounds, right? Give me the minimum value, the maximum value of this long list of numbers, right? Sort them all through. Give me the bottom and the top, right? The biggest and the smallest. And create a domain that goes from the smallest to the largest, right? And that's essentially what it does here. So it spits this out and it goes, okay, right? The smallest was 50,000. The largest was 150,000, right? All right, great. Yeah, fantastic. Now, let's say I wanted to convert that instead of 50,000 to 150,000. Let's say I want 50,000 to be equivalent to 0, 150,000 to be equivalent to 1. In other words, I want to normalize the values, right? I want to understand the percentage, right? Now I could just sort of take the minimum value and subtract the minimum value from all of those values, so that the minimum value again would actually be 0, and then take the largest value after that and divide everything by that largest value. And that'll give me a percentage, right? Or I can just do this remap. So I can say, here are all my values, and here is their current domain, the minimum to the maximum, and now remap them to a new minimum maximum, and I'm giving it 0 to 1, right? Now what that does is that begins to say, okay, anything that was 50,000 now becomes 0, anything that's 150,000 becomes 1, anything that's halfway between 50,000 and 150,000, what would that be? 75,000? No, that just makes my head hurt just trying to think about that. 100,000, so 50,000 more. 100,000 would be 0.5, etc., right? What I'm doing is I'm making this a multiplier. So then I can actually feed this into my recipe, right? And start to multiply one of my numerical parameters for, let's say, height or distance or something like that, right? And begin to use this number, plug it in, these energy values, and plug it in to make something either more closed or more open, or taller and deeper, or smaller and shallower, or whatever it is. That I begin to sort of equate performance in geometry, right? Okay, and so, instead of getting things like, let's see, what were the values? 66,000 and 74,000 and things like that. Now I'm getting 0.84, 0.76, 0.8, 0.96, etc., right? So the closer it is to 150,000, the closer it is to 1, you can see there's a couple of them there. The closer it is to 50,000, the closer I get to 0. And what that does is that makes it a really nice, easy way of using these as a multiplier, right? Again, so if I say, well, I only 15% of this is getting solar radiation, right? That's actually a pretty small value. What I can do is I can make that part of the calculating, let's say, how open a cell is, right? Okay, so let's talk about this just for a moment. Because all we're doing is we're generating new parameters to plug into, this is so silly, right? A UV coordinate, right? So again, finally at the very end here, we come back to something that we're familiar to, which is taking our original quads, exploding them into faces, edges, and vertices, beginning to build things off of the vertices and the faces. In this case, we're mapping a point along UV coordinate or latitude, longitude coordinate along each of these, right? And then generating a normal direction and a point at the location. We get vertices, we're starting to build triangle surfaces, etc., right? You notice here I have a list. And if I plug that list in with these that are data trees because they're dashed, I'd be really in trouble. So what I do, I sort of graph this to make this into a data tree so that it's also dashed. So now I have 3 dashed lines, and suddenly I get the results I want. Right? The data matches up. So let's talk a little bit about what's going on here. Okay. I'm just making 2 triangles, just 2 sides of a pyramid. Now the question of where that peak of the pyramid is what's being driven by the energy values, right? So the higher the energy value is hitting this thing, the closer this value gets to the opposing sort of, how do I draw this? I know. This is where your classmate Amanda, she's been waiting for this all semester. Crank these out. Look at these bad boys. All right. Take that, whiteboard. You're not going to get me down today. There we go. Halloween time. All right, so we have a quad. And we have this point, and this point, and this point. And we're generating somewhere along here a point out here that we move up. Then we start to, there's a triangle, right? Now, where this is located, if I locate it over here, I make something that's highly closed off. And if I move it over here, I make the component really open. Right? Open and close relates to, in this case, this recipe, where this point is sampled along my surface that generates this peak, which generates how far over these triangles reach, right? This shading. All right. That's my illegible sketch for today. So, that's essentially what I'm doing right here, right? So, and this is some of the things we were doing before, right? So let me just plug this in. I have this numerical number slider here, the multi-dimensional number slider. If I just plug that in, then each one will get the exact same value. And as I move it around, each of them change the exact same way, right? So I can open these things up more or close them off more, right? But that's not what I'm doing. What I'm doing is I'm using these values, and some of them I'm subtracting from 1, and I'm plugging them in for x and y, in other words, u and v, and then plugging those in as the uv parameter. So that, if you look at this, what's interesting and what's nice about this is that's why I normalize them between 0 and 1, right? So I can begin to map these values as u and v coordinates, right? And some of these where they are. So now you can see where you have the reddest, they're actually the most closed, right? And where they're the bluest, they're actually the most open. And depending on what those values are, and you can sort of get a reading of that based off of how much red, orange, yellow, or blue there is on each quad, you begin to understand that there is a sort of gradient there. So these things get more closed where they get sunnier, and then gradually open up where they have full shade almost. So that's all I'm doing down here, generating unique values for each of these shade components now. For that one parameter that I want to adjust, one or two parameters that you want to adjust, right? So figuring out how to tie these energy values back into the geometric recipe as new parameters, each one unique, right, to each of these quads is the key, right? That's the whole value proposition here, is that if the laser cutter doesn't care if these are all identical or all 100 of them are completely different, right? All it does is follow the curves that you give it, the lines you give it. So being able to measure it, optimize, and then manage all that information, that's on us. Once we do that, we can just feed it on the CNC machine and tell it to do its magic, right? Okay. And so that's all for today. I just wanted to show you that because what I'd like for you to do eventually over this weekend is begin to plug in and use this. And you have two options, right? You can either bring parts of this into your recipe, or you can bring parts of your recipe into this. And that's the other reason why I wanted to group these things together. You don't really have to do much to this, right? This is good. Just make sure that you're using 10 and 10 again, like you did, or 8 by 8 if a few of you were doing that. If you think that your thing is too complex and you need to make them larger, so you only need 8 by 8, let me know, because it's on a case-by-case basis. Ideally, a 10 by 10 would be the work. This is already given to you, right? It's really what you do with the energy values here and how they begin to connect up with your component recipe. You'll even see over here, right, that I even have the unrolled stuff and everything else, right? So they're all unrolled here in a grid for you. You can see that really it goes from like orange to blue really quick, right? Sort of interestingly. Be nicer to maybe smooth that out a little bit more, but I think you get the idea. And of course, if you weren't using this surface, well, the way to change this is to go back here, right? From left to right, that first ingredient, the one ingredient you have to give it is the surface to break up into quads, right? So set one surface, right, and we'll do that one instead. Turn that off so we can see it, right? Red to orange, yellow, and blue. All right. Now there are some nuances here, right? Some of you are running into this while laser cutting, right? So geometrically, surfaces have also a front and a back, right? You might maybe notice this if you've ever tried to offset a surface. It says, well, which direction do you want to offset, right? And it picks a default direction, and it's oftentimes pointed up like we would intuitively think, sometimes pointed down, right? You'll notice that sometimes when I'm building like a pyramid on a surface or something, like some of these weird shading components that we have in, sometimes I need to go in the negative direction in order to put it up, right? Okay. What that means is that the front of the surface is actually face down, right? We can check that in Rhino in the following way. Let me just show you here. So here's the two surfaces I baked in from Grasshopper surface classification, whatever that sort of sine wave field was. And if I go to Analyze Pull Down Direction, it'll say, okay, the front direction is up. If I want it to be down, I could say flip. Now it's down. It's giving me these white arrows, right? So I would just want to make it up. It's the same thing here. One of these was down for flipped for some reason. Before class, I flipped them both to be pointed up. Okay. Now, what's interesting is that if we're running the solar radiation on this and the angles are coming this way, and we're looking at the back of the surface, not going to display correctly. So that's where you want to flip it. So everything looks really junky and weird and not intuitive, like the way it did on here, then you would need to double check that. Now, some of you won't remember that, or some folks who aren't here and won't register it when you're watching the video. I'll get this question. I'll be like, first of all, you send me the Rhino file or Grasshopper file. I'll be like, I'm not at my laptop. It's Saturday evening, morning or something. I'm at the grocery store, right? I can't see it on my phone. Then you'll send me a JPEG. I'll look at it and I'll go, okay. You need to go to the Analyze pull-down menu, go to Direction, then flip the direction. Look at the arrows, and if the arrows aren't pointed up, then flip. Okay? That's essentially it, right? What's interesting about that is that surfaces have directions, which is nice because you can then begin to reference them. That's how you can go up in the positive direction and down the negative direction, or vice versa, depending on which way the front and the back is. So anyway, these are open, non-manifold surfaces anyway, so there's no inside versus outside. Like if they were watertight, like a sphere or something, then we'd have an inside and an outside. All right. So how many of you have been working with this surface? I'm just sort of curious, show of hands. And how many with the other one? So the ones that are here today, the majority are actually picking the synclastic, the sort of doubly curved, both going the same direction, dome sort of shape. All right, interesting. Any just preference or just dumb luck? How many of you are like, I just want that one? That one's great. Okay. Kind of weird, right? Like, why do we like certain things? That beats me. All right, so this is the example file that I gave for the day. We just went through it step by step, at least the big chunks, right? You can go down. But what I would recommend is sort of look at the labels when you get a chance and you have to look at this again. We can go over it again on Wednesday if we need to. In fact, we can do that in class, how many people actually bring their first of all, if anybody brings their prototypes in, we're going to take a look at those as a group first. But then after that, we'll take a look at this, and maybe then you guys can follow along and do some of this at your test during class. Okay. So the next step after this, once you get these things plugged in, is we'll start to talk about exploded axons and doing the assembly instructions. Right, so that's the drawings. So you can do another poster or two again to go along with the sort of physical prototype. So yeah, anyway. And again, this shouldn't be a surprise. These were the outcomes mentioned before, right? That's what I mean by these sort of things that are labeled, and you start to get the pieces, you start to understand how they go together, etc. These seem a bit crammed to me, honestly, but whatever. Any questions? You guys ready to get out here early? Not an hour early. Damn. Well, I'll be around for a little while until if anybody needs help, needs assistance, need things prepped for laser cutting. Okay. If you want to work here, that's fine. If you want to take off early, it's fine too. Individually, you can make up your own decisions how you can be most productive. At this point, I just assume, it's what, the last day of October? What happened to October, by the way? Holy moly, like blinked and it was gone, right? I just assume that everybody wants to get their work done, just can manage their time. Right? So, you guys are adults, so I'll let you adult that. All right? Give me a second to close some of this down, and then I'll just float around to anybody that needs help.